you were there. Listen, talk more about Michael Sowers. You were there. You graduated from Syracuse in '04. That was the Mikey Powell territory. And the guy that people always compare Sowers to is Mikey Powell. So what is your comp between those two guys?
Sowers is the closest thing I've seen to Mikey since Mikey. I did only one of his games, and it was against Denver when Bill Tierney came back to Princeton last year. It was the first time that I had seen him up close and personal. And I said a few times to Ryan Boyle. And Brian, who I've worked with a lot, Ryan was a contemporary of Mikey Powell. They were separated by only a year. They played against each other in 2 championship games, another postseason game beyond that. And I said to Ryan, I go, when you watch him, I mean, does it remind you of Mikey Powell? And he goes, yeah, there's a lot of Mikey Powell in Michael Sowers. The difference being, I think, the stuff that Powell was doing at the time has been emulated a lot since then by Sowers, by Pennell. There have been other guys, Jordan Wolf. When Mikey did it, there was a freshness to it.
Yeah.
And Mikey, if you talk to him, he'll say how he pretended to be Gate Brothers and Tom Marechek and Charlie Lockwood in his backyard when he'd go up against his older brothers Ryan and Casey. But there was a swagger. There was a Pete Maravich style to Powell's game. I mean, that's kind of the guy I compare him to. Pete Maravich at LSU, who was this prolific scorer and was also this great showman, but had a ton of substance. That's who Mikey Powell was in college, with the one difference being Powell won. Powell won, like one
He won everything.
National championships, played in 4 Final Fours, played in 3 national title games. He was the 4-time Attackman of the Year, 2-time Tewaaraton Award winner. I mean, he's one of the top 4 guys to have ever picked up a lacrosse stick in the history of collegiate lacrosse. He's on the Rushmore. So, again, to me, the difference here, stylistically very similar. How much of that did Michael Sowers get from watching? There's an element to that, right? The great ones study the other greats that come before you. You want to be a great writer, you study the guys who know how to write. You study the great Tolstoys and the Shakespeares and the Hemingways of the world. So it's the same way. I think Mikey Powell influenced the generation, and that generation that influences the next generation. That's where you kind of see Mikey Sowers now, Michael Sowers. So I think stylistically they're incredibly similar. It's the closest stylistically I've seen to Powell, but there was a mythology to Powell, and I don't think that is something that can be easily replicated. There was a mystique to Powell. There was an intangible quality. I mean, there was a play I remember where he's got a defender isolated, goal line extended, and he gives him a little stutter step shake, and the defender loses his footing, has his ankles broken. Powell waits for him, waits for the defender to get him. And then does it again. And I remember watching that, and I said, man, the first time he did that, he broke his ankles. The second time he did that, he broke his spirit, because it was almost as if, hey, I'm Yo-Yo. I can do this to you all day. And it was, kind of like the Muhammad Ali against Sonny Liston. Like, I'm waiting for you here. And so I just – there was that part of Powell's game. There was a brashness to it. There was a confidence. You may even call it arrogance at times, but it was fun to watch.
Yeah, that's the overwhelming trait with Mike. I think that's why so many people were so endeared to him, is that. And, for Sowers, I do think there is an aspect of that. Coming back to Syracuse, he's had the Michael Powell comparisons forever. Wearing 22, the number situation, Chase Cannon's already got it. I'm sure they'd figure something out with that, but the mystique of bringing Syracuse to its first title since '09, regardless of whether he picks it, it's probably something Pat March is telling him, come be that guy. Because Syracuse hasn't had a true Tewaaraton candidate since Jojo Marasco.
Yeah, and even Marasco was a Tewaaraton candidate, but he was never really the favorite to win it. He was in that mix because he was the top midfielder, almost by default. I mean, I'll give you the story that Charlie Toomey told me before the first round game last year. Loyola's getting ready to play Syracuse, and we're at Loyola's practice, and I say to Charlie, I said, hey, where do you feel you have the edge in this matchup? And he says, Anish, I'll tell you. And remember, Charlie was the goalie in 1990 for Loyola when Paul Gate and Gary Gate were firing missiles on him. So he's seen Syracuse at its absolute apex. And so Charlie says to me, I look at their roster and I see a ton of honorable mention All-Americans. I see top to bottom, they've got a better roster and they've got more talent than we do. But I feel we've got the two best players. We have Pat Spencer and we have Jacob Stover. And he feels I've got two first-team All-Americans in Spencer and Stover. And what was the difference in that game? It was Spencer and it was Stover. And so Syracuse had more talent up and down, but he had the two best players. And those two best players ended up making the big difference. Bringing in Chase Scanlon, I think, was a step in giving Syracuse that alpha that had really been missing for about 4 or 5 years. I mean, Nick Mariano, Sergio Salcido, really good players, quality players. But you probably have to go back to Kevin Rice.
Yeah.
Those teams with Rice and Donahue and Stotts to kind of find that for Syracuse. And those teams are really good teams that just – never could get to championship weekend, but they had championship weekend talent. So you get a guy like Sowers, to me, I mean, all of a sudden, this is now the best player probably to step foot on your campus, probably since those teams right around the turn of the last decade, when you had Galloway and Joel White and Kenny Ninn, Abbott, Lavelle. I mean, you're talking about a guy who, is probably on par with that great team. And that those teams from 07, or I should say 08, 09 through 11, those were 4 really good teams. So, to me, he gives you something you haven't had in a long time.
A lot has been made about the parity in college lacrosse over the last the development of the parity over the last couple of seasons. And you look at powerhouse programs. Syracuse, they haven't won. They haven't made the Final Four since 2013. Hopkins only made one Final Four this decade. For two teams that are so synonymous with college lacrosse, how do you think the development of all this parity affects these blue bloods? I guess is the wrong term, because there are a lot of blue bloods in college lacrosse. But Syracuse and Hopkins stood above the rest for a long time, and it feels like they're still getting back to that. I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Well, there's a few. It's more than just parity. One, the game has mushroomed down the high school level, so there is more talent to choose from than ever before. And while Division I has added teams, the rate at which teams have been added is not commensurate to the growth of the sport on the high school and prep level. So now if you're a Mercer or a Furman or a High Point is a great example, a fledgling program, you have access to talent. And you can dive into the rough. Whereas in the past, I mean, when I was in school, 2000, 2004, I mean, I'm telling you, it was 5 teams. 5 teams went into the year with a real chance to win. The championship was you had Syracuse, you had Virginia, you had Princeton, and then, every now and then you'd have a fourth. I mean, whoever that was, it was Duke was kind of, moving into that mix. Sometimes it might be an Ivy like Cornell. But really, I mean, Johns Hopkins was the other one, right? So, I mean, it's Hopkins, Syracuse, Princeton, Virginia. I mean, those 4 were in the mix every year, and it was like that for a long time. So now other teams have access to more talent. Early recruiting has also hurt blue blood. So you get a kid who's been playing lacrosse since he was 5 years old. He gets to high school as a freshman. He's dominating. He's got the great stick skills. May not be the best athlete. But because he's been the guy and he's been playing forever, the blue bloods are in on him early. They offer him. Most of these teams have 3-4 years in advance. So now they're on to the next kid, the next 9th grader, the next 10th grader. Meanwhile, you have a kid who picked up a stick in 6th grade, who's a really good athlete, but he's not quite a lacrosse player yet. Now in 8th grade, he's getting better. And now he gets to 11th grade, and all of a sudden the light goes on. And now the stick skills start to level up. The athleticism has always been there. Well, now there are no spots for him at the Blue Bloods. So he goes to a smaller school. He goes to a High Point. Now he goes to High Point, and he's getting the best coaching of his life now. And by the time he gets to the middle of his sophomore year, the athleticism and the lacrosse skills mesh, and that cold fusion creates a player who is now better because he's an athlete.
Yeah.
He's now better than the kid who's been playing his entire life, and the ceiling is higher. Miles Jones is the best example of that. A kid who picked up lacrosse late, came to Duke, and he was kind of a project. He was sort of this raw energy. He wondered when potential would become kinetic. Middle of his sophomore year, the light goes off, and all of a sudden, he's coming down the alley shooting 80 miles an hour with his offhand. And all of a sudden, everybody's going, whoa. Friday night against Virginia, he's shooting with a left hand. Miles Jones just became unstoppable. And for the next 2 years, he was the best midfielder in the country. So that's part of it, too. The other part of it is money. Tuition is skyrocketing. Look at Syracuse. When I was in school, Syracuse, when I was a freshman, tuition was $24,000 a year. When I was a senior, it ballooned to $36,000 a year. Now, what is it, double that?
Yeah, I mean, just about.
All right, so now it's 70,000 plus. So now if you're offering a public school kid from Long Island or Central New York and you're saying, hey, we can give you a half scholarship to come to Syracuse, his family is still on the hook for $35K, thereabouts.
Yeah.
15 years, maybe they had to scrounge up 16, 17K, which could have been doable. 35K, that was not really doable. Now you look at where the Ivy has been so strong. They rely on their incredible endowment, billions of dollars of endowment. So they can essentially cover a student's tuition when the family is making a certain amount of money. There's a certain money threshold. And so you're looking at middle class, even upper middle class. You can go to a Yale and you're only on the hook for cost of attendance because the endowment money will cover any family making a certain amount and less. I think it might be $150,000 or less. That makes it hard for some private schools to compete.
Yeah.
So have to work with some of these guys. And, what made Syracuse so good for so long, they had kids from Yorktown and they had kids from West Jenny and Carthage and Central New York. It was a blue-collar team. I mean, It wasn't the prep school team. It was a team full of blue-collar kids. You don't see as many of them now. And again, part of that, it's no fault of, how come they're changing who they are. I mean, the price tag has everything to do with it. The university's price tag, tuition is that high. Again, even if you're offering some money and you can offer a half scholarship, that's still a hefty price tag for a lot of middle-class families. So you're probably going to lose out on that kid.
Yeah.
And the Ivies have been one conference to kind of take advantage. So I think, again, you look at some of the private schools, it's harder for them now in college lacrosse than it was, again, 10, 15 years ago.
And I mean, both interesting points going forward, because obviously the recruiting has now changed for the class of 2021, where you can't talk to them before their junior year. And then it'll be really interesting to see how Syracuse and the ACC and these private schools handle the fact that suddenly there's an entire class that now wants to come back. And how do they sort those financials out? It'll be really interesting to see that. Anyway, Anish Shroff, thank you for joining us here on the CitrusTV Zoom chat. Thanks a ton. You can catch Anish on ESPN when the season is back in 2021, full force. Are you doing anything else before that? I'm sure you are.
Right now, just kind of reading, taking care of my 2-year-old and doing some stuff around the house. We are working on some lacrosse content for May, so be on the lookout for that. And then, hopefully I still have my little league that I do in the summer, and then football in the fall. So, knock on wood. I think as a country right now, we have to take precaution. We have to look out for our health and look out for safety. But in these times when things sometimes seem so dire, and sports has become such a great distraction for us, and not having that right now, I think we all feel it. That's kind of where we go to get away from things. So I'm hoping we can get to a point where we can at least have some real live sports back on TV and give people a little distraction if the conditions warrant it.
There you go. Anish Shroff, stay safe. Thanks for joining us.
All right, man. You got it.